Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody. Welcome back to the final day of the ICC International Trade and Prosperity Week. I'm delighted to introduce our panel in a minute on reforming the trade system. Much of the conversation this week has been around key priorities like collective action, climate action, digitization, SMEs, human rights, financing. But actually, much of that relies on the need to reform the trading system, to make the trading system fit for purpose for the 21st century. So this session here at the end of the week, in a way, is perfect timing to bring it together, particularly ahead of the WTO Ministerial Conference coming in a few weeks. So I think in terms of reforming the system, what we need is more transparency, inclusivity, alignment of trade frameworks with climate and sustainability, and of course, to support the digitization agenda. This couldn't be at a better time. For those listening, please do use the live discussion section on your either app or on your PCs for the event. And don't forget to post questions and answers to the panel throughout the session, and they will be publishing takeaways from today's discussion after the conference has concluded. So welcome to the session. I'm delighted to invite Sarah Gillespie from our ICC Australia team. So this is two ICC teams working together. Great example of how we work across the world around the ICC network. Sarah, can I hand over to you to take forward the panel discussion?
Yes, thank you, Chris. It's definitely great to be able to work with ICC UK on this great week. So hello, and thank you all for dialing in today, wherever you're joining us from. I'm delighted to be facilitating this discussion on some of the shortcomings and reform capabilities of the World Trade Organization in time for consideration by the next WTO Ministerial Council. So the WTO has been in situ since the end of the Second World War, regulating trade, global relations, and resolving disputes on the movement of goods and services. However, the current global market environment has made trade liberalisation less of a priority among many countries, which threatens the sustainability of the WTO. Now, in an act of thought leadership, the foremost network of business groups from the Asia Pacific has commissioned renowned macroeconomist Dr. Andrew Stoeckel to author a study on resurrecting the world trading system. Following the completion of this study, the Confederation of Asia Pacific Chambers of Commerce and Industry, what I'll refer to as CACCI, will deliver an evidence-based argument and plan for reforming the World Trade Organization, as well as the relationships with major global intergovernmental institutions. Now, joining me tonight are two distinguished speakers who I'm honoured to introduce. So firstly is Mr. Samir Modi, Chairman of the Confederation of Asia Pacific Chambers of Commerce and Industry. He's Executive Director at Modi Enterprises, also Executive Director of Godfrey Phillips India, and a Director of Indophil Industries. He participated in launching various initiatives for the Modi Group, including Modi Care, Colour Bar Cosmetics, and 24/7 convenience stores. He's received a gold medal in Delhi State Boxing Championships and is a supporter of philanthropic in the fight against AIDS. Samir, it appears that we share an interest in boxing, though I hope we won't need our pugilistic tendencies for tonight's discussion. Also joining me is Dr. Andrew Stoeckel, Honorary Professor at the Australian National University's Centre for Applied Macroeconomic Analysis. He is also Chief Economist at the Department of Premier Centre for Economic and Regional Development. Before that, he was founding chairman of the CIE, a private economics research consultancy set up in 1986. Over his career, Andrew has gained wide experience in public policy, commercial activities, and environmental issues. He's represented Australia at international forums, advised governments and private firms, prepared strategic plans for industry, and developed and analysed scenarios for major corporations. Thank you, Samir and Andy, for joining me tonight. So I might lead off the discussion first with Samir. Now tell us, why did the Confederation of Asia Pacific Chambers of Commerce and Industry instigate this project?
Thank you, Sarah. It's a pleasure to be here in the seminar and discussion. Firstly, the reason we actually went down to starting or initiating the study was because of the role CACCI plays in the region. Large amount of growth post the pandemic is coming from Asia, And CACCI, with the 29 member countries, felt that in order to go forward, we need to evaluate what the World Trade Organization is bringing on the table. How do we divide and break down borders and make policies more open for conducive trade? What do we need to do to encourage trade to happen in a seamless manner? And what does the WTO need to do to solve the issues that are facing us as a planet? And that is the reason we wanted to do a study, and that is why we initiated with Dr. Andrew Stoeckel, who's a great supporter of CACCI. He's done a previous study for us, and he is very thorough and very extensive in what he does. And we've got a full buyout from the 29 chambers that are with us, saying that they need something like this, and the WTO needs to act upon some of the suggestions that we have brought into the study.
Thank you. I agree. It's definitely very important to have all chambers on board. And Andy, how about you tell us around the process that you went through to undertake the study? What were the issues that you looked at and why those issues?
Well, it became pretty wide-ranging. And thank you, Sarah, and thank you, Samir, for that comment. The WTO, it's a terribly important thing because exports to GDP are about 30% globally, and their share has not been rising since the global financial crisis in 2008. Now, the WTO is fundamentally all about commerce across borders, and fundamentally, commerce, buying and selling things, is the only way known to mankind to generate the living standards that people want. And when I say living standards, I don't mean just money or income, but people want clean air, clean water, safe, secure environment, and so on. So all of that needs resources. And it's this economic activity of buying and selling that's terribly important. So we went back and we started to look at, well, what's the problem and what has caused this problem? And therefore, what are we going to do to fix it? And I can elaborate on that if you want.
Please feel free to give us a couple more points on it.
Okay. First of all, the problem is there that it's pretty clear that the three functions of the World Trade Organization are not working. The negotiation process is all stalled. It's taken 21 years to try and negotiate the removal of fishing subsidies. Something as obvious as preserving global fish stocks, right? And it's still sort of stuck in limbo. Secondly, countries should be reporting their barriers to trade, and they're not. Thirdly, the dispute settlement system has broken down and is not functioning at all. So they are the three sort of main problems. Now, what has caused this? Now, that's where it gets a little more complicated, because you can't fix a problem unless you know what has caused it. And what's caused this problem is actually, there's four parts to it. One is that there are some old problems lingering in the WTO system that have been there for a long time but never fixed. And you might want to ask, why is that the case? Second problem is that the agenda of the WTO has expanded enormously, right? But there's only one tool, and you can't kill two birds with one stone, right? So we're asking the World Trade Organization to do things that it cannot solve, which just puts it into disrepute. The third main problem is that the world has changed enormously since 1994, when the Uruguay round of trade talks was settled. And what's happened, we've seen is, in particular, the rise of the digital economy, and a whole host of new issues of taxation, of e-commerce, etc., has arisen, and privacy, security, cybersecurity, and how should we address those? The fourth problem has been the decline of multilateralism. And this is part and parcel of a very expanded agenda through mission creep, and also the lack of hegemony or leadership by the United States. So the United States' share of global GDP has basically halved since the 1960s. So those problems, and you need a world leader to really try and promote and advance in a slow-moving negotiation framework to try and advance the cause of a consistent, coherent set of rules that helps commerce across borders.
Thank you, Andy. Now, looking at those problems that you've outlined, I want to take a little bit of a step back and look at what the consequences are with those problems. So, Samir, as a business person, why is it important for you to need the WTO to be functioning effectively?
Sarah, I believe as a business person, I play two roles. One is to expand my business, and secondly, as a leader in the business world, to help in facilitating ease. Today, the challenge I feel is that the reason the WTO was created was to facilitate trade. And that's the only thing that's not happening right now. There's protectionism, there is a failure of discussion, all aspects that today one needs to be global are things that don't exist. And with the post-COVID, the world has changed. All of a sudden, the barriers that are there are being forced to break down. Therefore, can countries work with WTO, because WTO is a global organization, to remove those barriers, because it's in the good of everybody. It's just not in good of India or Bhutan or Nepal or Thailand, but it's in common good of growth that every company, every nation, every businessman is looking for. And therefore, if WTO can play that important role for which it was constructed in the first place, and I believe that we've done our job. And that is why this study that we're doing is to give that opening window, or calling a spade, calling it out. I think, like saying, guys, this is not working. But Doha talks failed. This is not working because we're not able to break the barriers. There's too much protectionism. Can we focus on the job at hand, which is trade? And that is the only thing that every businessman is looking for. Is looking for increasing trade, increasing the value, the turnover, the profit, the sale of their products, the reach they need to reach, the ease of doing business, ease of entering. But instead of that, I think large amount of time is spent in tackling and managing entry points. Small example, I'm wanting to enter the UK market. It's taken me 18 months and still can't enter because there's so much red tapeism and so many rules and regulations that prohibit you to do trade. And I feel that if the WTO plays that important role of facilitation, promotion, executing, and discussion, then the battle is won.
Well, hopefully the battle will not take another 21 years like we've currently been taking with the fishery subsidies. I wanted to pick up on the point that you just made about this report calls out the issues. But I think it's important to note that it does so very constructively. It's not just criticising, but it's very constructive in what we need to do to bring the WTO back in to support a proper rules-based order.
Right.
So Andy, in the report as well, on that topic, you mentioned a lot around transparency, which is very important, particularly for the WTO to serve the greater benefit for all of the countries that it works for. Now, can you tell us a little bit more about transparency and how a nation could go about an honest assessment process to measure their national interest?
Right. So first of all, the transparency mentioning, right, is transparency of process. It's not just the information that you have and it's available to everybody and all those regulations that Samir was talking about. It's what do they mean? So if there's hypothetically 20% tariff on the importation of ceramic jugs into Korea. Well, that's important information, etc. But what does that mean? Koreans have a choice. They could get rid of that tariff or they could leave it in place. Would they be better off without it or not? So the main fundamental thing is there that you can't make a decision in the national interest if you don't measure or don't know what is in your national interest. And the measurement has to be done in a particular way. It has to be done independently so people trust it, right? And so then it holds politicians who make the decisions on these barriers and these regulations. It makes those people accountable for their decisions, and it informs the public. So transparency in a proper process, and I go at great lengths in the report with an appendix to describe what those elements of a proper process are. So the fundamental thing is that the cost of a barrier or a tariff, if it's $10 a tonne, on the importation of something, that is not the cost. The cost is how much better off would you be if you removed that barrier? And that cost can't be observed. You can't look it up in the national budget papers or the Bureau of Statistics or anything like that. You have to calculate it. So that's why you need this economy-wide assessment of what are you foregoing. And that's a very important part of that process, because you expose the vested interests who argue for these barriers to be put on in the first place. And by exposing them, you weaken their influence. Next, you start to educate policymakers and the general public about the real benefits of trade. And thirdly, you establish who's really paying, because a lot of the time it's small and medium business enterprises, other businesses importing product, who then have to pay a higher cost for protection so that their products also start to become high cost and they ripple through the economy. And that's why it's a very complicated thing. You can't look these things up in a spreadsheet. It becomes a little complicated, but there are proven techniques for getting a handle on this. What we have to do is simply look at the social, economic costs and benefits of all these restrictions and all those policies that we've got. Now, that does not deny that there may be a national benefit or self-sufficiency criteria or national interest. There may well be. Now, if that is the case and it's genuine, that will show up in a benefit cost test. And so, that's not saying that every barrier or whatever is not legitimate. So there's transparency. The key thing when we launch this study to look at is understand that it's a process by which we go about assessing the national benefits and costs of policies.
So is this you volunteering to undertake this national assessment for everybody? Too big of a task.
There's different things. First of all, it's the question is as important as the answer. The question is, we have a choice. What are we foregoing by doing this? What is it costing? How is this rippling through our economy? Would we be better off changing that regulation or that policy or opening up those barriers, right? And again, you can't make a decision in the national interest unless you measure what is in the national interest. You're just flying blind. It's just random. And then you're prone to narrow vested interests who can then lobby and curry favour with select politicians for their own benefit at the expense of society. And the point is, it doesn't pay consumers to go along and do all this work themselves. Someone has to do it for them. But who do you trust to do that? So building that trust, you've got to have credibility, you've got to have independence, it's got to be economy-wide, etc., etc. So there's a few core elements there of a proper process to get right. Now, this is not new. Mind you, this is not new. It was recommended prior to the Uruguay round. but they made a mistake. They set up the wrong thing when they did the Uruguay round. They set up the trade policy review mechanism, and it's in the wrong place, doing the wrong analysis in the wrong way, and we've got to correct that.
So if you had your way, would you have any thoughts about where it would be to be in the right place or doing it the right way?
Yes, it has to be done in domestic capitals, because you see, irrespective of what others do, it pays to lower your own barriers to trade. The old saying is, just because someone else throws rocks in their harbour does not mean you should throw rocks in your own, right? You're worse off. It is stupid. So you should, in countries, in a world of nation states, where countries will act out of their own self-interest, right? So sovereignty is about the one universal principle recognised around the world, right? Countries have borders, you respect those borders, and therefore you have to respect what happens inside those borders. So countries themselves will act in the self-interest, but our point is that mostly they often do not act in their own self-interest because they don't even measure it. This is rarely done. In fact, great lengths, many countries and governments go to great lengths to hide exactly what barriers they're putting in place. And so you get all these non-tariff barriers. They're hidden, and they do that to try and disguise that fact. So we want to shed a little bit of light and get this transparency through a proper process in domestic capitals. And that is a fundamental core thing that we go through in that report.
Definitely, I think that's very important. As you mentioned, trust and credibility are two of the most important values, and they're definitely two values that we need to bring back and solidify with our version of a reformed WTO. Now, Samir, I'd like to have a bit of a discussion with you around CACCI. The CACCI represents many nations who were meant to have benefited from the WTO Doha developmental round, and yet it failed to gain much support. If the WTO can't progress, how can we continue to assist developing nations to advance and to lift people out of poverty?
Great question, Sarah. Just a thought in my mind. I was just rumbling through what would you ask me next, and I'm glad you asked me this question. We're not expecting the WTO to be Superman, and that's what we generally expect them to be. Our whole thing, right, the Doha talks failed simply because there was no room for negotiation. There was no room for hearing. There was no room for looking at a common cause. It was not, we have to look at it from a point of view of not blaming. It's not about blaming. It's not about criticism. The reason we've done the study and the reason the role of CACCI in the Asian Pacific region is to facilitate trade, is to facilitate cooperation, to build bond, to look at all kinds of insecurities out, and to bring transparency. And that is what the report is. It's also a validation of what's going on in the world. Like Andy said about fishing rules and regulations, took 21 years. We would like that to be removed in terms of how we think. The study is a thought process, a research done by Andy, extensive research looking into how the WTO has functioned, what the WTO is meant to be, what it can do. And if the powers are reinstated by demonstration by the WTO, by using some of the suggestions that we have given, we feel that they will do great good to the world, and they will reinforce the 1945 reason on why the WTO was first created. And that is what we are hoping to get out of the study, is that window of transparency, of calling it out, of really saying this could be a possible solution based on facts, figures, and things that CACCI and Andy have put together. And that is one of the reasons of no clarity, no transparency, why the Doha talks failed. And we are hoping that it doesn't happen in the next round of talks. Hopefully, with the use of the study and what the study has, we may be able to glide through that in a far more effective manner, because we have a buy-in from large number of CACCI members who are supporting the study.
That would certainly be a mark of success if this report can garner a very smooth next round. Now, I'd like to throw to some questions we've had from the audience first. I'll open it up. Samir or Andy, if either of you would like to answer this first. Is there an opportunity for middle economies, so UK, Japan, Australia, Brazil or Singapore, to proactively bridge the dialogue between the power blocks, so EU, China and the US, in order to broker some solutions? If so, what could we all be doing differently?
Well, I can certainly have a go at that. Yes. Power goes with knowledge, not just economic size, right? Doing the right thing. So if there's a group of countries of like-minded thing who understand really the main issues, then we will start to see progress. Ultimately, in a world of nation states, then there will have to be compromise where sovereignty is respected. This is a crucial thing. See, people think that international rules are the same and should be enforced like domestic rules, but you can't. Unless you're going to invade another country, compliance with international rules, right, depends on voluntary compliance, right, out of your own self-interest. So this is why it goes back to the domestic transparency issue. Now, if a group of countries coalesce around that idea that you mentioned, yes, then you will start to see some progress. So power just doesn't revolve around military might or anything else. It also revolves around good ideas. And anyone can inject them in. The smallest country on the planet can do that. And so we've got to try and this study is about trying to help build that coalition of common thinking around what would be some sensible things to do for the World Trade Organization.
Thank you. Samir, did you have any comments you'd like to make around the opportunity to bridge dialogue between power blocks?
I do, Sarah. One of the things that, if you look at the study and look at the CACCI membership, in the countries that we are in Asia Pacific is made out of small businesses. There are a number of people involved and businesses involved is far more than the developed nations. And therefore the hunger for them is far greater to penetrate the global nations. And likewise, since the Asian communities are driving trade very fast, I think you said the UK, you said the US, Japan, Australia, Singapore, it will be in their benefit by utilizing these points that we have highlighted in the study. It'll be in their benefit to enter the Asian markets, which hold a great key to successes. So it has to be a bilateral two-way channel. What Andy had mentioned about openness, about international rules being different to domestic rules, I think it's an amalgamation of both, and it will benefit everybody.
Well, that's certainly the intended function of the WTO is to benefit everyone. Now, on that topic, this is a question for you, Andy. So measuring the national benefit to society is exactly the language used by Catherine Tai in the US administration. So how do we best work with the US to find better ways of measuring that action and that benefit?
Yes, a very good question, Sarah. There is a lot of this assessment of benefits and costs that are done and what's in the national interest, but mostly, often you don't see that, right? It is not done through the proper process that I keep on harping on about. So to the independence and the credibility and so on. So we have independent judiciaries, we have independent central banks, etc. But when it comes to assessing a lot of these barriers to trade, we don't assess benefits and costs. And when it comes to a dumping case, for example, no country in the world assesses the benefits. They only ever assess one side of the equation. They only ever look at the cost and the injury that's caused for that. Now that's a legitimate thing to look at, but there's also benefits, right? So a balanced assessment would look at both. Now, no country does this, and it's all enshrined in law. It's loopy, lousy economics. And this is why anti-dumping policy has been called the protectionist's weapon of choice. You resort to that because you'll always find injury. And so there's a way around that. And I go through in the report the right way to address that and fix it. There is a simple fix to that problem. So a lot of these things are coming in, and because the WTO said it all starts to compound, because the World Trade Organization and that multilateral system is breaking down, people have rushed into forming bilateral trade agreements. Now, a bilateral trade agreement with every other nation is not the same as a multilateral agreement, because the minute you have a bilateral agreement with a country, then you have to decide what the imports are. If you're going to give a preference, you have to, if it's a bilateral agreement with Mexico, you have to decide what is a Mexican good. But what is a good that's half made in Mexico? Is that thing? So you have to have all these rules of origin. Next, subsidies are a big problem, and you cannot get at subsidies through a bilateral agreement. So you're missing half the play. So the world is busily inserting all these regulations and problems and making the going harder that Samir referred to earlier, just in trying to get some goods into England through all these regulatory arrangements, which country and so on. So that's one thing leads to another, compounds, and that's why we've really got to go back to basics and say, what really is the World Trade Organization all about? What is it? And it comes quite simple. Go from the very start. Trade. What is trade? It's commerce. It's buying and selling across borders, either a service or a good or whatever. It's buying and selling. It's commerce, right? Now, all that commerce happens in a market. It's the only system we have for generating the level of prosperity we see around the world today. Every market needs rules to function. Some of them are property rights, some are regulations, standards, etc. You can't put poison in canned tomatoes or something. So to have confidence in a market, you need these rules. Now, domestic rules within a country are okay, because if someone does the wrong thing, you could send the police around and put someone in front of a judiciary. But what do you do on the international thing? Aren't there also gains from having rules internationally? Yes, there are. But then the rules are useless unless they are going to be complied with. So in a world of nation states, the only way you'll get that compliance is out of voluntary self-interest. And so you can't comply with your own self-interest if you don't even measure what's in your own self-interest. So that is step number one. And do it properly in a certain way, you'll change the politics of protection. And people will understand the real benefits there is from international commerce.
Now, this protectionism versus globalization debate has been especially strong with the pandemic, and we've seen a lot of activities around the world in either side, particularly highlighting vulnerabilities out of supply chains. So another question to both of you, how do we make the case for lowering those barriers when voters or consumers are often concerned about losing jobs or dropping standards? Samir, did you want to take this on first?
Yeah, I do actually. It's a double-edged sword, right? From losing jobs and losing or dropping standards today, especially post the pandemic, has become more relevant because the internal markets have decreased due to less consumption, more fear, the whole concept of saving money, and therefore, if economies open up, it'll be both ways. You'll find bigger markets for consumption, and you also find new products coming in to your own market for consumption as well. So I feel that if the trade barriers are broken down, it's really going to be a case of thinking differently, thinking bigger. In terms of votes, usually the fear is of losing the vote bank. And if I do this, will I lose my voters? Therefore, if I lose my voters, will I lose being re-elected? But we look at the flip side of it. If your consumers and voters are happy at what you're doing, and they're satisfied with the growth of the economy, with the job being utilized elsewhere, you will get the votes. It's just the perspective of half full and half empty. What do you choose? We are looking at half full, while the world may look at as half empty. And that is our role as CACCI, to bring about members in our member chambers in the various countries to have a buy-in, and for them to work with their ministers, for them to work with policymakers to help them see this picture. India could be one of them as a case and example. If we are able to demonstrate openness of neighboring countries and transparency of neighboring countries, and no fear of losing or no fear of being misguided or losing out, then this is far easier for countries, big countries, or faster developing nations like India to participate. That is my view entirely on, and that's why the study becomes even more relevant, is really looking that from a half full perspective rather than from a half empty perspective.
Definitely very interesting. And I think we can agree that the three of us, and hopefully everyone on this call, shares your views around looking at it from the right side of the glass. Andy, did you want to make any comments?
Well, it's another very good argument for why multilateralism is so important. Because yes, there are job losses, and yes, there are adjustment costs when you open up, but you can focus the political economy is such that you can focus on that factory closing or whatever, but you don't focus on where the other jobs are created. And this has been analysed ad nauseum by the World Bank of many years, and there's a big 3-volume study that was done looking at all trade liberalisations and so on, and you create as many jobs as you lose. And the jobs are better jobs because you are concentrating on those industries where you are most efficient, right? So the whole case of commerce is efficiency. And the reason why I don't do my own plumbing, and I have plumbing, I don't do my, a lot of repairs and painting, etc., is because it's more efficient if I get a specialist doing it, and we exchange. And it's this exchange and having more of it, we are better off. And that's the fundamental thing. So multilateralism, it's really what I describe in the study as the fallacy of composition. You see, if you go to the racetrack and you want to see better, and you stand on a box, well, you will see better. So that looks obvious, doesn't it? So if everyone stood on a box, everyone could see better, couldn't they? No, they can't. Right? Or everyone would be better off if they stood on the ground. So acting together, and that's the value of having a World Trade Organization where people can get together and say, hey, if we all reduce our barriers, we're all going to be better off, we'll generate bigger gains, and the adjustment costs will be far lower. It should be a no-brainer as a thing. So it's a matter of getting this cooperation and convincing people about that very basic point. So there's an education thing, there's a combined, fallacy of composition issue there to address. All of those things need to be understood. And in the report, I explain all these and why we've got to this messy position that we're in today.
And in addition to that, you've given me some great nostalgic flashbacks to being in crowds and not being able to see through people because we're all the same height.
Well, yeah, I bet you, Sarah, I bet you've been to a rock concert and the people in front stand up and you can't see. So you're forced to stand up. But then the people behind you can't see. They're forced. So that's what this sort of rush into bilateral trade agreements is about. It's perfectly sensible for these countries, right, to go in, because otherwise you're sitting down, everyone else is standing up, and you can't sit down the front on the stage. So it makes sense. But then if you say, hey, everybody, why don't we all sit down in these comfortable seats? We'll all get the same view and we'll be more comfortable. We will be better off. It is as simple as that. So getting this cooperation and this level of understanding, and that really at the end of the day, trade is about the unilateral importation of things as well. It's buying and selling. There's two arms, right? And it's no good stopping one arm because you stop the other arm. And the joke of it is an import tax, stopping imports, is a tax on exports. It's the export sector that bears the burden, because the only purpose of exporting is to earn the foreign exchange to pay for the imports. So if you stopped all imports, eventually any country would stop all its exports. And the export sectors are the efficient, they're the good sectors. So why on earth do countries want to stop these imports? It's just lunacy. And that's what we've got to try and sort out.
Andy, I'm in awe, and I definitely think you're the only person I know that could take a conversation about rock concerts into imports and exports. But I'd like to ask you about another experience you've had with the UK in terms of understanding the costs of domestic support systems historically that led to a reform agenda there many years ago.
Yeah, well, one in the United Kingdom, it was at the height of the Uruguay round, and we're trying to get some reform of the European agricultural policies. So just by way of background, Europe had put on a whole series of subsidies and protections for their agricultural sector. And they'd gone from a large importing thing to the world's second largest net exporter of food. And then wine was being stored in municipal swimming pools and things like this. It was just lunacy. Anyway, we wanted to do that, but again, the jobs lost question was going to come up. And then, so I estimated then what would these losses going to be? And it was on the day we released this study over there in Britain, and it was on the day that Mrs. Thatcher called a general election. And she said, it's about jobs, 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 right? And our study showed that Europe had lost 1 million jobs every year, right, over 20 years, a job every minute, over 20 years out of the farm sector. So it wasn't saving these jobs at all. And that's the whole thing. You can't do something silly and also generate prosperity and jobs. Right? Jobs comes from activity and people wanting services or some goods, whatever. And the more economic activity, the more jobs that are created. But I do acknowledge that there are adjustment issues, there are costs, and they have to be addressed. And often we've given too little credence to some of those issues. But again, everyone acting together, pulling down barriers to trade, right, lowers the costs of adjustment and creates more opportunities. And the world would be vastly better off if we could get to that point.
Couldn't agree more. Now, in the spirit of that cooperation, Samir, how does the private sector propose to remain active and relevant in ensuring a functioning WTO? Should industry leaders be more outspoken to try and help make the case for trade liberalisation?
I think that it again boils down to really CACCI. CACCI's main agenda and the engagement of the 29 countries with the 32 chambers within each other to first agree that there is a role, there is a need for breaking down and opening borders, that there is a role for not fearing trade and investment, that there is a role that is not for a particular industry or a chamber or a country, but it is to work to tackle the global recession as a whole. And if you're able to do that, which is a slowly chipping block, India may be one of them, you can name the countries. Everyone has their own fears, reservations of not being heard or not having a say or getting a raw deal. Our goal is really pointing that out. And I'm hopeful that with the help of discussion like this, help of working with the ICC, we are able to slowly and surely look at the future globe. That if I could look into the future, what would that look like? And if we can get enough buy-in, I hope that we are able to get other countries, including India, moving toward this future vision of saying a global one economy, rather than saying we want to be global, but we want to be in chunks and pieces and protect who we are and not open up. Like Andy said as well, is really about being global versus being local, is what my viewpoint is. And my hope is that in the past, I think for the first time recently, India has not been blamed for the collapse of the WTO. And I'm hoping that we're able to accentuate that by saying it's really not about India. It's not really about one nation, but it's about a global initiative. And we can help the WTO look at a different scenario and also help the member countries of CACCI agree to different scenarios, then I feel the job of discussion and not failing will become easier.
And on that more somber note, is there a risk that future of the WTO is that it could fail and that we could revert to trading blocks? And where would that path lead us?
There's a question of risk is always there, but my question to you would be, what is the downside? The WTO has already collapsed. So how much further can it go? There's only one way: either you go up or you stay where you are. And the research that we have done, we are hopeful. If our recommendations are even listened to and what we're saying even adhered to, or there's an open, transparent view to the views that Andy has spent extensive time with research and his knowledge of the industries and globalization is done, then there is no downside. Because when you're down, you can't go further down.
It's a very thought-provoking approach. Andy, do you agree?
Yes, and Samir is right. Although he used the word collapse, and that's not discussing that, it's really, that conjures up an image of a bridge that's fallen down, right? So the demise of the WTO is more like batteries in a torch that have been left on. They're gradually going flat. And so the batteries are still there, but they're inoperative. They're not doing anything. It's sort of, it's faded over many years. So this issue is not new, right? So that's a critical thing to appreciate. So this problem has been going on for a long time. A lot of people think that it was President Trump and his trade war with China and suggesting he ought to pull out of the WTO, that caused a lot of the trouble. But before that, the Doha round had collapsed. Before President Trump even thought about running for presidency. And before that, the Cancun ministerial meeting collapsed. And before that, there was the Battle of Seattle in 1999, when that trade talks there, that totally collapsed. And President Clinton was in charge then. So the rot in the system has been going on for some time, and that's underappreciated, right? And the rot has been going on because there are some fundamental contradictions in the rules. So there is one rule which says, don't have discrimination. You can't have discrimination. But then another rule says it's okay to have discrimination. So what is the public supposed to make of that? Is discrimination a good thing or a bad thing? And so you have these conundrums. And then you have another rule which says export subsidies are a bad thing. That's dumping. But then as part of the Uruguay round, export subsidies for agriculture were allowed. And we didn't get rid of them until a few years ago. So Are export subsidies bad? Is dumping good? Is dumping bad? So people need to think through carefully the coherence and the consistency of these rules that we have. And then you'll have some clear messages and people will understand those issues in a far better way. Transparency processes do that. They educate and inform the public, and eventually people start to see what is a better way to go about things. So it's a big issue.
Well, I definitely think that all of us being here tonight proves that it is a very big issue, but that we're all enthused and encouraged to address it. Now, coming up to the end of our time, so I'd like to ask you each one last question. So Andy, I'll go to you first. We've just spoken a little bit about the barriers to trade that are being erected and the disputes that are occurring, even though the dispute system has faltered. What would a better system look like for you?
On the dispute system, probably the Americans are right that it's a single stage process. The problem with the dispute settlement system at the moment, the main one, is the appellate body. It has started to become a lawmaker, right? But in an international world of sovereign nation states, then the rules have to be agreed to, and there's lots of compromise and argy-bargy in agreeing that. But unless we have one global government, we won't get complete globalization or a common set of rules or standards across the world ever. And nations seem to cling to that issue of sovereignty quite dearly. This is what Danny Roderick often calls the trilemma. You can't have democracy, globalization, and sovereignty. You can't have those three things together. You can at best get two of them. And people think, so the real issue is really try and just understand that fundamental difference between international rules and domestic rules and their application. And therefore, what the G20 says, let's have a rules-based system, there's lovely words, and that's quite correct. But that's just hollow words unless you're also going to set up the mechanism by which those rules will be complied with. And in international rules, the only compliance is voluntary, out of self-interest. And you won't get people acting in their own self-interest if they do not measure what is in their own self-interest. And that's what domestic transparency is. It's a measurement. It's not just reporting what a tariff is here or a subsidy is there. It's what is the economic effect of that. And would you be better off as a nation changing it? Because you have a choice, right? It's up to every nation with sovereignty. They can allow things across their borders or disallow them. And over there, we're talking now in England, of course, and the British have been through that whole Brexit debate and so on. So, but the thing is that Britain can largely get most of the gains from trade just by opening its own borders, acting in its own interests. The case for free trade is largely a unilateral one. 80 or 90% of the benefit from opening of borders accrues to yourself. I'll go back to that original statement. Just because someone else throws rocks in their harbour does not mean you should throw rocks in your own. And I'm looking at you there with this beautiful Sydney harbour behind you, right? Now, if Australia started throwing rocks in there and blocking up the harbour, which would be stupid, why should, Tokyo Bay block their harbour? Well, they'd be mad to, wouldn't they? So the point is, irrespective of what others do, it mostly pays to act in your own self-interest and to open up your own borders.
Thank you, Andy. Now, Samir, I know that this report and this project wasn't entirely funded out of self-interest, but a group interest by CACCI and member chambers. So now that the report is complete, what are the plans for the launch and beyond?
One is that we're first exposing it to our members and the chambers to take it to their individual ministers, to the trade, bodies to the lawmakers. And the second is the CACCI itself is going to do rounds after launch on the 29th of the formal report to various bodies across the globe to promote and inform about the study and what does the study bring onto the table. So there's a plan that has been backed by doing the study, and also now CACCI is spending the money through its own fund and the member countries or chambers to market and educate and show what the study means and what it does. It comes from my thought process is the WTO expected to be a Superman and therefore be someone who creates law, or it was created to understand and involve developed and underdeveloped nations by giving everyone an equal voice that would cause transparency and consensus led to decisions for the common good. That's the flip. You may say, what's wrong with the WTO not doing anything besides being a facilitator? There's nothing wrong. But what good does that bring? What does it bring on the table? How does it help the common man in a country or a country that wants to expand or a global view? Why should barriers not be broken? And if that is the case, when one says a WTO is good enough where it is, my view is not. And that is not the reason the WTO was first created in the first place. It was created to help nations facilitate a global trade and make life easier. And if that is what the reason that WTO was created, sitting there doing nothing doesn't become an option. And us not having a voice, or us not saying that this is what options are available out there, is also not acceptable. If CACCI has to be a responsible corporate, or not corporate, chamber, and do justice to our members, we just want to make sure that there's transparency out there.
Well, thank you, Samir, and thank you, Andy. This has been a very enlightening discussion, and thank you all for joining us this evening and helping to start this conversation about the reforms that we need to achieve a successful world trading system. As Samir mentioned, we don't need a Superman or a Superwoman, but I do encourage you all to join us for the launch to formally receive this report and CACCI's recommendations on October the 29th. So thank you, and I would now like to hand back to Chris.
Thank you so much, Sarah. What a fascinating conversation that was. It's flushed out a whole heap of questions that are rolling around. I mean, I think there's an awful lot of parallels to the points you're making with what we're hearing elsewhere around the world, actually. So I'll be really interested in supporting the report, and certainly I think we should take it up to ICC Global and see if we can get it some airtime. I think it's definitely worthwhile. I think all the points you're making are 100% valid. So what a terrific session. Thank you so much, Sarah, for helping us put this on, and thank you to our speakers, Samir and Andy. It's been great to see you, and to be honest, just brilliant to hear different perspectives from different parts of the world. It's so important that we understand what's going on out there. So with that, I'll just say thank you to our audience and all the questions, flurry of questions coming in on the session. Our sponsors, of course, wider supporters across the ICC and beyond. And just don't forget that the content will be available for 7 days for anyone who either hasn't seen it or colleagues who want to see it. It's all there for you. The next session will be at 11 o'clock British Standard Time. Another session with our colleagues in Belgium this time to answer one of the questions that we get asked a lot is how do we work together as chambers of commerce at local level, both the international chambers of commerce and local chambers of commerce as allies for the benefit of business and society. That's going on at 11 o'clock. So come and join us for that session. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you, Chris, for having us and your support to CACCI. And we'd love to answer all the questions that are out there. I know there are many. And I'm sure with CACCI and ICC working together, we will be able to get somewhere. And I would like to say a very big thank you to Sarah for facilitating this extremely interesting session. We like to speak wherever we can, help in educating and creating transparency. So thank you for giving us the opportunity to do so.
100%. Let's keep talking, for sure. Thank you very
Okay.
much, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.